Hello everyone, my name is Alarith Uhde, I'm from Siegen University, and I'm going to present the paper Fairness and Decision Making in Collaborative Shift Scheduling Systems that I wrote together with Nadine Schlicker and Wallach from Ergoscience and Marc Hassenzahl also from Siegen University. This is a brief overview of this presentation. First, I'm going to talk about the motivation behind our research and then present the two studies we carried out. Study 1 was a qualitative phenomenological interview study, and study 2 was a quantitative experimental vignette study. And finally, I'm going to briefly discuss our results and design implications. Okay, so we focused on shift scheduling because it plays such a fundamental role in the life of shift workers or nurses in our case. And in everyday work life, in a hospital, for example, the schedule would normally determine who gets which weekend off or who has to work, for example, on Christmas. But also it implies a lot more, such as whom am I going to work with, or who works in the shift before, and does he or she usually prepare everything correctly. So the schedule comes with a lot of social implications, and when looking at the distribution of free weekends, for example, fairness becomes a very central topic. So we were curious how a scheduling process could be designed to be as fair as possible and hopefully, besides fairness, also increase job satisfaction and subjective well-being. There's a lot of discussion about fairness, especially in the fair machine learning or FairML community recently. So for our paper, we based our definition on the organizational justice theory, and in order, not to overcomplicate things, here we understand fairness and justice as equivalent. So the organizational justice theory looks at fairness as a subjective judgment rather than a universally applicable objective concept. It also focuses on the workers, so in our case the nurses who are affected by a scheduling decision. And fairness in this model is multidimensional, so we can distinguish between a fair result, a fair process, fair information handling, and respectful conduct. More specifically, the fairness of the result can be evaluated based on so-called allocation norms, and we distinguish between three different norms. The equity norm focuses on individual performance. So in our case, a decision about distributing resources or influence on the schedule, in other words, should take high performance into account to a greater extent. For example, this could mean that a nurse who often stands in for sick coworkers should have more influence than another nurse who doesn't do that. The equality norm says that everyone should get the same amount of resources, such as free weekends or influence on the schedule. And the need norm says that participants who need more influence because, for example, of an illness or because they are single parents should get more flexibility in this case. Most other recent fairness papers in the HCI or FairML communities only distinguish between equity and equality and summarize both performance and needs under the term equity. But as far as we could retrace that, it's based on a paper by Wallach and colleagues from 1973, which makes a few, from our perspective, problematic assumptions, because it understands basically all social relations, including things like romantic relationships and friendships, as fundamentally egoistic and profit-oriented by the participating individuals. And we wouldn't really agree with that, so we found the reply by Deutsch from 1975 more convincing, and so we have equity, equality, and needs as our three norms. Okay, so in our first study, we wanted to know which of the three allocation norms apply in which way in the context of shift scheduling. And also, with regards to the organizational justice theory, we wanted to know how its dimensions are represented in shift scheduling, so fairness of the result, process, information handling, and respectful behavior. We chose the IPA method because it focuses on the subjective experience of the nurses, and we asked them to tell us about specific experiences they had that were especially fair or unfair. Okay, so what did we find? In terms of the result of a scheduling process, we found that equality was the guiding norm on an abstract level. So, for example, without any further context, people would say that everyone should be treated the same way, or weekends should be distributed equally among the nurses. However, this was very different when they talked about specific conflicts, as you can see in the right, for example. In that case, the guiding norm was the need norm. And in the example here, the nurse said that the nurse who had the most important appointment should get the free shift. And as a counterexample, she could have also said that the planner should, for example, see who had gotten more influence on the schedule recently or more wishes for free shifts granted, and then give the free shift to the one with less influence in the past. Or in terms of equity, who stood in more often and should therefore get the shift. But we found that the need norm was the most prominent here. In terms of the fairness of the process, we found that inclusive decision-making was perceived as fair and exclusive decision-making as unfair. And as an example, a previous ward planner had always asked for feedback during planning, and this was seen as fair. For information handling, we found a conflict between two requirements. On the one hand, participants wanted to know why a decision was made that way, but when they submitted a wish for a free shift, they didn't always want to disclose their reason for it. So, yeah, but the problem is that oftentimes another nurse's wish is the reason they don't get their shift granted, so transparency and privacy are in conflict here. And finally, in terms of interpersonal justice or respectful behavior, we found that a positive team spirit plays an important role because nurses are more open to discuss their wishes if they like their coworkers. Okay, so much about study 1. And study 2 was a complementary quantitative study in which we tested some of the central findings from study 1. So we assumed that on an abstract level, with no further context given, nurses would take equality as their guiding fairness norm. But in case of a conflict, we assumed that solutions based on the need norm would be perceived as fairest, followed by the equality norm, and decisions based on the equity norm would be seen as least fair. And finally, we also compared decisions made by an algorithm with decisions made by the nurses collaboratively, and assumed that the collaborative decision would be perceived as fairer, independent of the result. So we first included 2 open questions about fairness and gave no further context. The first one was about fairness in general, and the second one on fairness in shift scheduling. After that, we included a number of so-called vignettes, as you can see on the right, for example. And our vignettes consisted of specific scheduling conflicts in which we varied the norms, the winner, and the decision maker. Okay, so our first hypothesis, that equality would be the central norm if no further context was given, could be confirmed. Most participants included equality arguments, followed by need arguments, and some also included both, so multiple coding was allowed. We found no performance or equity arguments, however. Okay, so the second and third hypotheses could also be mostly confirmed with some minor reservations you can find in the paper. Decisions based on a need argument were perceived as fairest, followed by equality arguments. On the other hand, decisions that were made against a need argument were perceived as least fair, followed by equality, and decisions against an equity argument were perceived as fairest. When looking at the decision maker, we found that collaborative decision making was perceived as fairer than decisions made by a computer alone, also independent of the decision itself. We have a few design implications. Equality should be the guiding norm on an abstract level, so for example, weekends should be distributed equally among the nurses. But we also found that conflicts should be resolved based on individual needs. So we would say that we should not make the mistake to just use equality as a foundation for conflict resolution as well, and instead resolve them on a need norm basis. Also, inclusive conflict resolution would be recommended. And finally, we found that cultivating a positive team spirit, besides all the other positive effects that can bring, can also have a positive effect on fairness because it facilitates conflict resolution. For further research, we see two main questions. The first one is how we could solve conflicts if need-based decision-making fails. For example, if both nurses have a very high need, for example, they need to take care of their child. We saw that the nurses were quite creative in activating resources, such as other nurses from different wards or so, to find an acceptable solution for everyone, but still this remains an open question. And second, the conflict between privacy and transparency is still unresolved, although we would argue for interpersonal face-to-face conflict resolution, which gives nurses full control about which information they want to disclose to whom. Yeah, these are the articles I used in this presentation. And with that, I would finish and thank you for your attention.